Okay, we're going to get started. So my name is Richard Lowry. I'm a professor at the McComb School of Business at the University of Texas, and I'm a senior scholar with the Salem Center for Policy here. And we're very pleased to have James Lindsay with us to talk about the effect of critical theory on the modern university and talk a bit about his book, which is Reverse Cynical Theories. So thanks very much, James, for joining us. And so as a general intro, one of the things we do at the center is to bring in sort of ideas from a broader set that would usually be explored or accepted on college campuses, particularly ours. So this is an example. This is part of our mission to sort of promote free speech at the university. And we're also, as a policy center, we're very focused on bringing sort of objective empirical analysis into the policy space. And then, I have a kind of an interest in this book because it seems like critical theory is kind of the main alternative to that approach in thinking about policy. It's a sort of a different way to think about evidence and such things. And we're also very interested because unlike in a lot of these sort of philosophical debates, Dr. Lindsay has actually run something of an experiment on critical theory. So as a kind of empirically driven center, we thought this was a particularly interesting approach. So that's why we're doing this. And so thank you very much for coming. If you wouldn't mind just jumping in and explaining to our audience what critical theory is, and we may have a lot of business school people where it's not everyone. So that'd be, if you don't mind taking a couple minutes to just give us a broad overview.
Yeah, I like how you actually framed that against the idea of empirical driven policy, because empirically driven policy really should begin with the evidence and work outward, whereas critical theory begins with the theory and then fits the evidence to the theory. You see this kind of, I think, gross error, not only in critical theory. You often will find it in the psychological sciences or the social sciences more broadly, where they begin with the theory. I know this is controversial to say in the kind of very not controversial way, but terror management theory is, for example, a very famous example where, you have this guy, Ernest Becker, and he wrote about the denial of death. And you have this theory that human beings are afraid to recognize their mortality, and it shapes their behavior tremendously. And then you can see a lot of just people kind of shoehorning the data to fit, breastfeeding reminds us that we're animals. Therefore, people freak out about seeing breastfeeding in public because it reminds us that we're animals. Therefore, we're going to die. And so, you can kind of see that theory-driven side of something rather than the evidence leading, where we say, here's a phenomenon, let's gather data on it and try to figure out why that's happening to the best that we can. And so critical theory actually arose in the 1920s. Its first systematic description, though, was in 1937 in a long essay or a short book, depending on how you want to frame it, by Max Horkheimer in the so-called Institute for Social Research, which is better known as the Frankfurt School. That essay was called Traditional and Critical Theory, and he starts off by explaining this is what theory is, what is a theory, what does a theory do, what's it for? And then he explains that, in a sense, it's basically riffing off of one of Marx's more famous injunctions, where he said, that the philosophers have sought to understand the world, but the point is to change it. And so he breaks down that traditional theories try to seek to understand the world as it is, and critical theories add in a normative dimension to try to understand the world in terms of how it fails this normative vision and how to change it to fit that normative vision. So you can see that it starts with the conclusion and tries to get there. So there's a certain circularity to it. A critical theory, according to Horkheimer, writing in 1937, has to have three essential components. He didn't break it down in a very organized fashion in this very long 80-ish page essay. So if you go read the essay, you won't find this, but this is a summary that most philosophers following him have attributed to him. It must have, like I said, a normative vision for society. These guys, it has to be said, were neo-Marxists. So their goal was to figure out why Marxist revolutions had not occurred in the West. Why did they only start taking place in peasant societies like the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia? What kind of happened in Hungary and then fell apart? sort of what was starting to take place in China, although the 30s was a little bit early. The rumblings of that were kind of already starting, but Mao hadn't stepped in. Why was it only working in situations like that? And in particular, because Marx had predicted that socialism follows late industrial capitalism. When the contradictions of industrial capitalism become too unbearable, the proletariat will suddenly realize that this is an intolerable situation, and they'll revolt and lead into socialism and eventually communism. And this was his dialectical materialism, is what he was outlining there. And so you would expect these revolutions not to be happening in Leningrad, but rather to be happening in New York, in London, in Berlin. And they certainly were not happening there. And in fact, that was a huge question. Why? What is Western civilization doing that's preventing these from taking place? And so the normative vision he had was something like, not necessarily communism, but something like the neo-Marxists kind of changed what the utopia on the other side would look like. They didn't agree fully with Marx, but something like a communist-shaped utopia, a freedom from the liberal order, a freedom from the Enlightenment, a freedom from capitalism, and all of the contradictions that those things produced, as they claimed. So that gives you a normative vision. So that's one thing. The second is it has to be able to, and this is the critical part, it has to be able to explain how the current social order fails that normative vision. It doesn't have to understand the social order. It has to understand how it does not meet that particular vision. Traditional theory exists to understand the social order. Critical theory exists to explain how it fails that normative vision. And the third thing is that, as Marx indicated, a critical theory must, as the saying goes, wed theory to praxis. So praxis is I guess, funny word that means theoretically driven action. In other words, activism. So it has to be able to be put into play by social activists. So critical theory takes a vision for how it believes society should be. It has an ought ahead of its is, if you will, to put it kind of in Humean language. And then it criticizes the way that society fails that. It actually, for your philosophers in the audience, it's a very Hegelian dialectic that they're calling to. It's here's the statement of how the world is today, the society is today. That's a statement, a thesis. What's the contradiction to it that we can also find? That's its antithesis. Put those together to try to find a broader whole, a synthesis. And so it tries to re-invoke that very almost alchemical social process to create social change. And it has to, like I said, it has to involve, by definition, to be a critical theory, it has to involve social activism on behalf of that normative vision. So that's what critical theory is. And it explains why it is theory first, evidence second, rather than evidence first, and then creating a theory out of the evidence.
Thank you. That's I suppose, as clear an explanation of something that seems kind of fundamentally foggy as I imagine we could get. And there's several of those things I'd like to dig in more, but maybe before we get there, we can jump into a quick description of what has sort of brought you to prominence as I don't know, critical theory scholar, though not a, or I don't know how you describe yourself. But
I'm a troublemaker. That's how I describe.
Well, that's yeah, fair enough. But we, the thing that sort of certified you as someone who could speak to these questions was your grievance, the grievance study affairs. And so, just maybe to build some credibility here, is before we delve deeper into some of these questions, can you give us kind of an overview of what the grievance studies affair was and what you learned from that?
Yes.
Since this is a university-based thing, I think it's particularly an interesting aspect for us here.
Good, yeah. And there is a little bit appearing in the academic literature about it finally.
Oh, really? Oh, good.
Actual debate, not just, oh, these people are bad, which was what the first few papers or whatever. Now there's actual debate coming out about it. There's a guy, Jeffrey Cole. He's actually, I think, a fairly famous neuroscientist who's written some critique, but with partial praise. We've been able to write a paper responding. A sociology journal has agreed to publish that. They accepted it. We'll see if that happens. It hasn't been published yet, but they have accepted it. So we'll see what happens. So there is debate beginning in the academic context, which we're happy to see. So we need to go back to the 1990s to get a little bit of context, or else it's going to seem a little confusing for people who don't know what's going on. In the 1990s, we were at kind of the pinnacle of the high postmodern phase of social commentary. So this was billed by a friend of ours, Alan Sokol, as fashionable nonsense, along with his friend Jean Bricmont. And I don't know what Bricmont's position is actually, but Sokol was a physicist. He's a mathematician now. I believe he's associated with NYU, but he lives in London. And what he did in 1995, going into 1996, right at the winter, right at the change of the year, was he submitted a paper called something like Transgressing the Boundaries, something quantum gravity. And he wrote this absolute piffle hoax paper and submitted it to a postmodern social commentary journal called Social Text that was published by Duke University Press. And their editors accepted it. And he just played off of silly puns and just crammed in a bunch of quotations from famous people like Jacques Lacan, John Lacan, either way, the postmodern psychoanalyst. And Jacques, I think, is his first name, but I can't recall. At any rate, he wrote a number of these. He just had a number of quote mined out of context quotations from very famous postmodern thinkers and philosophers. And he took terms like, the axiom of identity from mathematics and then completely misinterpreted it to have some social meaning that it has nothing to do with. And he did this repeatedly, and including talking about, I think he essentially argued that gravity doesn't really exist because of quantum mechanics or something like this. And it was accepted. And then he revealed that he had pulled an academic hoax on them, and much embarrassment. And it's partly credited, significantly credited, if you look at this whole kind of fight between the scientists and the postmodernists in the academy in the 1990s. It's been dubbed the Science Wars. It was considered a major strike against the postmodern social commentary side of the academy in the 90s. And although not the only thing, Gross and Levitt published Higher Superstition the year before, for example, that was maybe more traditional critique and had maybe more impact. Hard to say. So in 2016, there was a paper that was published in the geography literature in a very high impact factor journal titled, I don't remember what it was titled. It was about feminist glaciology. It was about something like ice, gender, glaciers, something, and is about talking about how we're never going to solve climate change unless we make glaciology into a more feminist and indigenous science. This stuff that in 2016 people would have said what, and now everybody hears it every day. And so no big surprise that this was happening. This was not solely funded, this particular paper, but the research team was operating on an $800,000 National Science Foundation grant. A lot of press was devoted to this. The researchers in the university, which I believe that they were operating from Oregon, had to defend, no, it's not fake. Journalists were saying this has to be a hoax. This can't be real. It's that absurd to read it. And so my friend and colleague, Peter Boghossian from Portland State University, and I decided in late 2016, after having read a fair amount of the gender studies literature and not having the slightest idea what it was talking about, we decided it was probably the case that, much like Alan Sokol had believed about the postmodernists, nobody knows what none of these people know what they're talking about. It's all just buzzwords and jargon. And so we wrote a hoax paper called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. It was accepted by a predatory journal in 2017. There's a scandal we uncovered there, but we focused on the wrong thing and went after gender studies. The scandal was that we had submitted it to a real masculinity studies journal that had rejected it. And then they internally forwarded it to the predatory journal owned by the same publishing company. They asked us, are you willing to forward this? So there was a scandal there, but we focused on the wrong scandal. Here. And so this created quite the controversy around us attacking gender studies, which is verboten. And so Peter and I discussed it, and we brought in our friend Helen Pluckrose, who I wrote Cynical Theories with, and we decided that we were going to redo the experiment and do it better, do it right. We were only going to target high-level journals. We wouldn't allow any low-level journal, below a certain threshold. Certainly, one of our rules was if its impact factor is 0, no, it's not going to be on our list. But we're going to also target the top journals that we can, Gender and Society, Gender, Place and Culture, Hypatia, and so on. Famous journals, if we could, Feminist Theory. And we set about writing as many papers. The project was to write as many papers as we could until we got caught, or until we were going to write papers for 1 year, and whatever we got done, and then see through the revision, resubmission, et cetera, process. And if so, it would probably take 1.5 years to finish the whole thing. And if maybe we get caught out in the middle, but it was to go as quickly as we could. And so we ended up writing papers for 10 months. The first plan, we had 2 research questions, was, can we actually hoax them like we thought with the conceptual penis? And we answered that question definitively starting in August of 2017. We answered that question definitively by November, when Many Masculinities returned 1 peer review set of comments on one of our hoax papers and just obliterated it for all the right reasons. Under-researched, badly argued, doesn't make sense, non sequitur, like every reason that you could. I don't think you even read your sources, this kind of stuff. It's not clear that you understand what you're talking about at all. Absolutely all the right reasons. Total credit to that reviewer for what he did. I assume he. Total credit. And so we changed tack. Our second research question was, if we cannot hoax them, what is going on here? What does it take to get published? So what we started to do was read their literature in detail, and we didn't know the name for it at the time, but it's called a reflexive ethnography in anthropology. What we started to do was to mimic what they were doing. I like to put it this way: we mimicked it with amplification. We exaggerated the trends, the themes, what we thought were errors and problems that we saw. We exaggerated them, fed that back into the peer review system by submitting these papers and seeing what the peer reviewer said. And then I had the rule. It was usually my job to deal with any peer reviewed comments, to then amplify further. If they gave me feedback and said, oh, this, that, and the other thing, you need to change this part, my goal is to escalate. But otherwise, always give the reviewer what they want, which is also an academic corruption, right? Give the reviewer what they want, just turn up the volume. That was my rule. And so we ended up doing this, and we had 7 of our, so there were 6 papers, I should say, that were hoaxes, 14 with this new reflexive approach. And 7 of those, before we got caught, were accepted. And a sociologist, after the fact, agreed that it probably would have been 11, and possibly 12 of those 14 would have been accepted, based on the way that the peer-reviewed comments had gone, because we got caught by the Wall Street Journal before we were done, so we didn't get to finish the whole process. 7 were accepted, 7 were still under peer review when we were caught and dragged into the public.
And to clarify, you had spent like about a year writing these, a year-ish study, like.
Yeah, so we wrote that.
Like, if you did this in a, like if someone did this in math, if they came in with no training in math,
right,
and spent a year like studying math and then wrote papers for a year and got a CV like this, we would be putting them on. I mean, this has happened, and those people are famous. And
yes, kind of, one of our papers won an award for excellence in scholarship, as a matter of fact. But so we were prodigies of the field.
Critical theory savant? Is this some special like?
No, it's just really easy.
Okay,
it's just really easy. But yeah, the timeline is that we started writing the fake hoax papers in August of 2017, realized that would fail in November of 2017, spent December reorganizing and regrouping, and started rewriting again in January. So from January until the very end of May, early June, we were writing novel papers, and that's it. So about 5.5 months is when all of the papers that got accepted were written. And that's 7 of them were, like I said, 7 accepted out of that bunch, with 4 or arguably 5 more ready to go. Some of these were pretty egregious things to have written, pretty difficult stunts to have pulled, as we'll probably discuss. And so, yeah, it turns out that it's not hard to complain. And when you have absolutely no requirement to rely upon data or adequate analysis, but only theory, it's very easy to just write theoretical piffle. So we could do this approximately 1 paper every 13 days is what the time worked out to be. 1 full academic paper, 8,000 words, full formatting, references, the whole thing, every 13 days. And we could have done this indefinitely, I think, as long as we could keep coming up with ideas, and the ideas are just easy to come up. I could have probably, if we had not been caught, done 50 of them the next year, 50 papers, probably 46 at least of which would have been accepted. I have no doubt of that. Arguing absolutely insane things. So yeah, it's not savant. It's just not hard.
But the people who are doing this, there are people at universities doing this for a living, right? And they tend to have PhDs that they spent 5 or more years on.
Yeah, it's really kind of not that good for them to have this, kind of goofy, as we phrased it. We have a lapsed mathematician who's never seen any critical theory or any social theory in his life. And then a philosopher, Peter likes to point out, I'm a assistant professor of philosophy at a 5th tier state college. And then we have a woman, Helen, who, despite her brilliance, has only a master's degree in literature. And so she has a little bit of background in theory, but only as it applies to literary theory. And so we were able to figure out to where we would have been, literally could have been the rock star of the entire, and not just the discipline, because our papers actually spanned 15 subdisciplines.
Well, interdisciplinary research is a theme at universities now, so you've got that.
It was very interdisciplinary.
To
usually with no more than having, so we're writing a paper in feminist geography. Well, what's feminist geography? I don't know. I'll go read the Wikipedia entry and I'll write a research paper on this tomorrow and literally get it accepted, and that one won an award.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's not real good for academia to have to face down. It was a lot easier for them to call us mean than to admit that something might be wrong. And we tried to be very careful. We didn't say, oh my gosh, sociology is garbage, psychology is garbage, the university is garbage, peer review is garbage. We didn't say that. As a matter of fact, we proved that the peer reviewers were not asleep at the wheel with the first half of our effort. It's that particular set of disciplines, which I think are best described, depending on the level of accuracy you want, but it's theoretical humanities or critical constructivist humanities. Those fields are corrupt, and it's very easy to produce garbage theory that was getting, the peer review comments on our papers were glowing. Important contribution to feminist philosophy. That was on a paper that we argued you're not allowed to make fun of social justice for any reason, but they can make fun of you. And in fact, it cited us. It made fun of our conceptual penis. We actually said that we were terrible people in our own paper, and we made the argument against our own project and published it I had it accepted by Hypatia, the leading feminist philosophy journal, under the title "When the Joke's on You." It's a little meta. So we had, I thought we really uncovered something here that was of some importance. Another peer-reviewed comment was this was an important contribution to knowledge. I pardon anybody's ears. I don't mean to be inappropriate, but that was a paper where we argued that straight men have a problem with transphobia that they could overcome by putting things in their rectums, by practicing. They would no longer be transphobic. And we put absolutely horrific, statements in that paper, just horrific ones. And all of our papers, though, those aren't the most famous ones. Those didn't get as much play as some of the others. We had a paper that was about pornography watching, and we had all this. The point of that was that we had a bunch of fake data that we made up, and we said that there was no statistically significant result. However, here's a theoretical reason why there's still a result, even though there was no statistically significant result. And the peer review advice we got was just cut all of that statistical stuff out and just rely on narrative, and it'll be a much stronger paper, which, you talk about putting theory ahead of empiricism. Yeah, that's alarming. So we had many papers. We had many, many papers. And those 3 that I just mentioned still are not the ones that got the most attention. I know that you kind of wanted to talk about the dog paper. And
although if there's any way we could talk about that in remotely PG-13 terms, I guess we could. That was your award-winning paper, right? We did. We got recognized for excellence in scholarship. What we did, that paper did rely heavily on fake data, but the data was so ridiculously fake. It was, we claimed that we, as a single feminist researcher, sat in 3 different dog parks in Portland, Oregon, over the course of 1 year for 1,000 hours
Now get this part, but never in the heavy rain. We noted that, never in the heavy rain. It's heavy rain in Portland 100% of the time, except for 2 months of the year. So like it's dry through the summer and then it's rain the rest of the year. Somehow we had 1,000 hours, we claimed. And then we examined in just 3 dog parks, 10,000 dogs' genitals. 10,000 dogs. There are not 10,000 dogs in 3 dog parks. This is just preposterous. And we claimed just ridiculous things like that we were observing, you know, like the number of times people like threw sticks at their dog, like all kinds of just crazy, did jumping jacks to get their dog to stop barking. I mean, just ridiculous. How many times dogs went to the bathroom on each other? Just stupid stuff. And then in the first draft of the paper, so the editor actually saw this. The very first draft of the paper we submitted, we said that we didn't have access to the data any longer because we put it in a recycle bin.
Okay.
We had destroyed our own data, so they couldn't possibly ask for it. That was actually in one of the drafts of the paper. And this was given exemplary scholarship. So the goal was, what we started with was the idea that we want to conclude that we could overcome rape culture by training men the way that we train dogs. And we used the dog park as the setting to get to that conclusion. And the mechanism we used was basically an implicit bias test by watching how people reacted to what we call dog humping incidents and dog rape. Because they told us we couldn't, not being a dog, we don't know when a dog wants to have sex and then when it's being raped. We can't tell unless we're a dog. So we actually have in the paper, thanks to the peer reviewers, the line, as a human and not a dog, is in the paper.
I guess that wasn't clear from the context of you writing a paper.
That's correct. And, you know, we only refer to people as the dog's human companions throughout the paper. I mean, trying to be quite PG about it, but we then claimed that watching this implicit bias test, watching how people responded, basically we said that when there was straight dog rape or sex, that males cheered it on and females were aghast. And when there was gay dog sex or rape, that males were horrified. They didn't know what to do. They were just, because they couldn't handle their homophobia came out. And so that was an implicit bias test of a sort that we then fed into, in the paper, we said Black feminist criminology as a means of why, I don't know, because it was just something to stick in there that didn't make any sense. That's why we chose it. So we analyzed that through a lens of Black feminist criminology to conclude that the only reason we don't put leashes on men or shock collars is because it's not politically feasible. And to conclude that dog parks are, we called them petri dishes of canine rape culture, and rape condoning spaces, an exact parallel with no evidence whatsoever to now nightclubs are also petri dishes of human rape culture and rape condoning spaces. And that was the justification for our conclusion that we should leash men if we could find the political backing for it, et cetera. And that paper won an award for excellence.
And this was in a journal,
what journal? Gender, Place, and Culture, which was rated the number, not depending on which rating, I think on the, what is it called? It's been a long time. The Skimago, is that right? Journal ranking, that was number 9 in gender studies at the time.
So this is something I might find at the University of Texas Library, for example.
I would expect you would. It's the number 1 feminist geography journal. The award was recognition in their 25th anniversary year. So it's not like some new journal that had just popped up. They were celebrating their 25th anniversary. The discipline clearly has no bearing at all on reality. It has no ability to tell what. I understand that false data is a sin. I understand this, but we made the data as false as you could possibly imagine, and they expressed surprise at the data in terms of just how thorough it was, without any skepticism whatsoever that this actually is maybe physically impossible to have gathered, and that nobody in their right mind would have been examining dog genitals, for example, and recording the results.
I mean, my field is sort of economics and finance. We're going very much more towards, if you have data, you can't just keep it to yourself. You have to.
That's why we said we put it in the recycle bin. So
right. We're supposed to be putting our data out on, so people can run their, replicate, because there's a bit of a replication. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You're able to just say, well, we throw away the data and you can still publish, I suppose.
Yeah. And like I said, it did not end up in the final. Yeah, right. Because it's Portland. It did not end up in the final draft because we had a word limit problem and we thought maybe it was too big of a red flag. So we could cut that. But the first draft, which the editor actually read, The first draft of the paper said that we placed the data we destroyed the data. We shredded it and put it in a recycle bin so that nobody would be able to ask us for it, even though it's just absolutely preposterous. I mean, this is academic misconduct to the max. And nope, gave it an award.
Okay. And so there were a couple other papers I thought we maybe could hit on before we dig a little deeper. So another one I thought was interesting was the progressive stack, an intersectional feminist approach to pedagogy.
Yeah.
Remember what you proposed in that?
Yeah. So the progressive stack, so people who don't know, progressive stack is a technique where you decide to right the wrongs of history by favoring certain people based on usually either some kind of maybe it's just basic demographics. Maybe it's, we propose that you use the so-called step forward, step back game, which is very prominent in kind of freshman orientation on campus now. So, everybody stands in a line across from another. If you were raised in a house with both parents, take 3 steps forward. If your parents made over this much money, take this. If you happen to be of this race, take a step back. And so everybody steps forward and steps back, and you can visually see how privileged everybody is. It's a really
Wait, this is something people actually do at?
Oh yeah, it's all over the place. So the progressive stack, we said that you could take the results of that in the classroom and then decide. The further forward somebody is, the more privileged they are, the less you don't answer their emails, you don't respond to them in class. And in fact, we recommended that you encourage them to sit in the back of the room or in the floor wearing chains, or interrupt them on purpose as an educational experience so they can see what it's like to be disempowered so that they can learn in their privilege.
So you were basically proposing to torment certain students on the basis of
white men
characteristics.
Yeah.
That's an interesting.
Yeah. And to give special treatment and extra credit and et cetera to other groups. And the progressive stack actually was first employed during the Occupy Wall Street movement when the so-called woke activists took over, which was an astroturfed thing. A lot of people don't know that. They came in and they started progressive stacking the meetings so that, we're only going to listen to, Black women have to speak first. And if they use up all the time, nobody else gets to talk. Okay, whatever. So that's where the idea of a progressive stack came from. That's where it originated. What had happened was right before we wrote that paper, there was a case at University of Pennsylvania or something like this, where some teacher, some professor got in trouble for using it in their classroom. So we're like, let's just say that that's a good idea. And we wrote the paper and we took it really far. Like I said, we advocated that white male students should be talked over on purpose and invited to listen and learn in silence while sitting in the floor wearing chains. We called it a learning opportunity named experiential reparations in the paper. And so we submitted this to Hypatia, which is a leading feminist philosophy journal and one of the leading feminist pedagogy journals. Educational theory is what pedagogy means. And so they were very warm to it. And in fact, what happened, we did not yet publish it, but we're certain it was on the pathway to publication. They kept revise and resubmit. It was on its 3rd draft when we got caught.
So it's the 3rd round revise and resubmit, at least that's pretty much done. Like that's
exactly.
It's going to be, So
and so their problem with it was, in particular, that we had argued, because this is as you identified, this is tormenting certain students. We had argued that we should not be cruel to those people. We should treat them with compassion. And they wrote back that we needed to nuance around what's called Megan Bowler's pedagogy of discomfort, and that we should not recenter the needs of these poor white students by caring about them. That in fact, we should make sure that they're as uncomfortable as legally possible so that they can learn more effectively about privilege. And this was absolutely horrifying.
So you were insufficiently sociopathic while trying to be over the top.
Yes. Like we thought, having to sit in the floor wearing chains. And it said, we argued that, well, what you need to do is, if you're going to do this, because it could be traumatic to them, which should commit trauma to no student, is that you should use what they call critically compassionate intellectualism, CCI. And the response was, don't be too compassionate. You need to go learn about the pedagogy of discomfort and how discomfort is integral to creating learning around the issue of privilege. So yes, be more sociopathic. We were shocked by that one. I mean, most of what happened we thought was either kind of hilarious or worrying at varying, degrees. That was truly shocking. And that's when we realized that we were up against we are uncovering something truly ugly and horrific.
I'm wondering what, if parents knew that this is what people at major universities seem to think should happen in the classroom. I wonder if parents might have some concerns about sending their children to these institutions.
That's why we're really upset that that one did not get through the process before the Wall Street Journal decided to tell our story for us.
So I'm sorry, I'm a little more disturbed than I was hoping to get.
And we didn't even get to the next one yet.
Yeah. So this one is actually my personal favorite. I didn't write down the whole title, but it's "Our Struggle is My Struggle."
Yeah.
Could you summarize what that paper was?
Our Struggle is My Struggle is a rewrite of chapter 12 of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. So that's a chapter. It turns out not many people have read Mein Kampf. I had the displeasure of reading. It's a 2-volume. I didn't even know it was 2 volumes when I set out to do this, but I had to find something suitable to rewrite. That was the goal. So I was reading Mein Kampf. It turns out chapter 11 is the famous anti-Semitic chapter, not chapter 12. He barely mentions the Jews in chapter 12 at all. They come up a couple of times, but for the most part, they don't. It is the what is required to make our movement, which he was calling our movement at the time. He didn't refer to it as Nazism, but it's what is required of to form Nazism. What sacrifices have to be made? What does it look like? Blah, blah, blah. And so the first pass was I copy and pasted the entire chapter into a Word document. And I just took everywhere he said something like our movement or the equivalent and changed it to intersectional feminism. That's it. First round, that was the only thing I did. And then we had a number of objectives. One was that we had to make the sentences actually make sense, because obviously he was talking about a completely different subject and context. Another was that we had to be able to pass a plagiarism check if it got sent to one. So we had to change. People have criticized us to they say that they rewrote Mein Kampf, but nowhere do you find a single phrase of Hitler's exactly. That's right, because plagiarism checkers work by finding 3 consecutive words that are identical. So we made sure that there are no 3 consecutive words that are identical anywhere. And then we had to interlace in theory. And so what we chose was what's called choice feminism. There's an entire special issue of a feminist journal tearing apart choice feminism, calling it choosing betrayal or something like this. And I can't recall which journal that was, but it's not hard to look that back up. And so we cited most of the papers in that special issue of the journal, built it around that, and then submitted it to a couple of feminist theory journals to see what they would do with it. And so we rewrote the thesis to be around intersectional feminism. We changed the wording so that it's not identical, but we maintained as much of the angry grievance politics as possible. And then most importantly, Hitler lays out in that particular chapter a 14-point summary of what his movement will require. Because of length requirements, we condensed it to 8 points, but we have an 8-point plan written right into it as to what to do to form the movement, and retained as much of Hitler's tone and ethos as possible. That politics of grievance was what we really wanted to maintain. And so we submitted that to the journal Feminist Theory, thinking we even were joking around, like, what's the probability that this thing's going to get in? And it was like 1 in 500 chance that they'll even consider it. Next thing you know, I get an email, we've sent it to peer review. And I'm like, okay. And so a month or so later, it comes back, or a few weeks later, it comes back from peer review, and Feminist Theory had rejected it, but they gave us some comments. They're like, this is a very interesting project. It's like, okay. And they gave us some suggestions, and we massaged it according to their suggestions and submitted it to a feminist social work journal called Ophelia, and Ophelia accepted it. Ophelia was like, Nazis, yes, okay. Granted, it's not like we just took the Führer's words himself and sent them in and said, what are you going to do with this? We complained, depending on how much detail you want. It's like Hitler's a modernist and we had to make it postmodern and blah, blah, all of these different complaints. And he's very sweeping and grandiose, and it's a manifesto, and you can't write a manifesto as an academic paper. But it turned out that there were just tons and tons and tons of these very angry quotes about choice feminism and every other thing. That was so easy to find quotes that just matched Hitler's tone. Railing on feminists who choose for themselves what they're going to do rather than sacrificing themselves for the cause. Very easy to find lots and lots and lots of quotes to back that up without taking them out of context.
is there something deeper underlying these similarities? Like, is this just, is it a coincidence that these two things end up kind of converging to a similar?
There are two factors. There are two factors that lead them to converge. One is the underlying politics of grievance. That's it. Hitler was doing politics of grievance. People argue, perhaps correctly to degrees, that Trump was doing the politics of grievance with his MAGA business. The politics of grievance is the easiest path to demagoguery that you can possibly imagine. So Hitler's doing politics of grievance. We call this grievance studies. They are doing politics of grievance as well. So that's one convergence. The second is, and this is going to be very uncomfortable for many people who are adherents in the social justice movement, but the reality is that what Hitler was doing was racialized politics of grievance. And when you start talking about intersectional feminism, you're talking about a differently organized, but still racialized politics of grievance. Hitler was doing identity studies, although his identity studies were pro what he called Aryan in German and anti-Jewish and then other. Especially, he wasn't fond of Black people and he wasn't fond of disabled people in particular. Or Slavs. He also, it turns out, wasn't fond of communists. I forget what our analog was, but I had to find every use of communist and change it to something else. And I forgot what I've used. I don't remember if I think we changed communist to neoliberal every single time. It was the neoliberals, because neoliberal feminism is the other target we shot at. So he very much, we had somewhere, I could probably dig it up on my old machine. In fact, we had a, what do you call it? Like a codex or whatever, where it was like Hitler says movement, we say feminism. Hitler says, communist, we say neoliberal. And then it was just make the sentence work and then make it pass. We actually went and downloaded or bought access to a good plagiarism checker to make sure it wouldn't get caught. Which causes dedication. I mean, it's the easiest way to filter the thing out. So we had to do it. But I was shocked. We were utterly shocked. I mean, our jaw dropped, I think, all three of us, when that paper got accepted by a social work journal. Although it's very angry. It is. It's extremely, as you would imagine, it's an extremely angry paper. I don't think it's as shocking as the positive reception of the progressive stack paper. I still think that was the most shocking thing that happened.
Yeah, I hadn't really dug into the details on that one as much. So yeah, I'm still actually a little shaken, like literally.
Well, there's a little lighter. We had another paper that I still begrudged the timing. You know how it goes, right? Sometimes peer review, depending on the editor and whoever, is really fast. Right. If you just get lucky, and sometimes it's really slow. So we submitted to Feminist Theory a paper arguing that the artificial intelligence is being made in a masculinist way, and that was going to cause the singularity, which we misinterpreted to mean the end of the world. And so that the solution would be to make our advanced artificial intelligence would have to be irrational and feminist. That was the answer, and that would solve the problem.
Totally in line with some of the discussions in that area right now.
That's happening. That's all come true. And so we submitted it, and they actually accepted it with no change except the length. They said, make it shorter. And so we made shorter that day and sent it back the next day. And they dallied, and it did not finish its acceptance process.
Well, so yeah, that's these fascinating papers. So maybe now we can turn to, like, if this is this is a significant movement on, or this is a significant academic area on college campuses, it seemed to have a lot of influences. This would seem to have some pretty serious effects on what goes on at universities. So, for example, if the people who sort of accept the progressive stack paper are, teaching classes, this seems like an environment. Is this an environment where this is their opinions, but you can come into your class and a student could come into their class and express any set of opinions, or is there going to be some restriction on?
There was definitely, you're not allowed to, express anything against the social justice thing. I should point out also, I forgot about this. The first two drafts of the progressive stack paper were purely theoretical. They were not this was not adequate to them. So in the last draft, I just pretended I was really doing this in a classroom and just made up, oh yeah, I did this and this is what the students said. And some of them complained and this is what I said back to them, So I gave them in the third draft the impression that I really am doing this in my classroom. And they were like, okay, this is much better. Yeah, that's a thing too.
So then I pulled out a quote, I think a quote from perhaps Allison Bailey, who I think you reference occasionally. And
we cited her a number
of times. In your book, The Critical Pedagogy regards the claims that students make in response to social justice issues not as as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequality. So that suggests to me that there's an argument that you're not even allowed, that students should not be allowed to question these sorts of theories. Is that a fair description of the kind of attitude?
Yeah, it's pretty close. What she's actually saying in there is that if you try to criticize their critical theory, then what you are doing is you're not arguing from a place of, say, rational thought or critical thinking. You are actually just asserting power. You are probably one of her chief concepts is what she calls privilege preserving epistemic pushback. So people, when they encounter social justice ideas, will seek to maintain their power and privilege. She has an entire paper from 2017 in Hypatia, the leading feminist philosophy journal, about privilege preserving epistemic pushback. And her argument in that paper is that when you are in a social justice classroom context and you present social justice material, sometimes students will argue back against you. And when that happens, that is not them making an argument. They are, in fact, responding by trying to assert power to maintain their privilege. And if, let's say, it was a Black woman, because you have to play their identity politics the way that they actually arranged them, that was making that argument, then it would be that she has bought into the power politics. She has false consciousness, whether it's internalized misogyny or internalized racism, and is trying to uphold that. So whether it's white supremacy or patriarchy or misogyny. And so the ideas themselves are expressions of power, and that people, the power itself, the power brainwashes people to accept them. And so it's impossible to disagree with there's no legitimate disagreement. In fact, one of her other collaborator or colleagues, Barbara Applebaum, has a book called, and I'm going to get it backwards. I psych myself out every time. It's either Being Good, Being White, or Being White, Being Good. I think it's the second one, Being White, Being Good. It's about white complicity. And in that, she makes the argument that you can disagree with social justice type material if your goal is to understand it better. But if your goal is to disagree with it, then that's not legitimate criticism. It's coming from a place of power, and the effort to maintain power. So in a sense, they are very explicitly arguing that it's impossible to disagree legitimately with what they're putting forward.
That seems like an interesting take on what should happen at a university, given that I would have thought that.
Yeah, critical theory, it turns out, is not actually a theory in the traditional theory sense. They separated them for a reason. It is, in fact, a takeover ideology.
Yeah, because it was hammered into my head in graduate school that if you're doing theoretical work in economics, the fundamental question is, do you have empirically testable propositions? And if you can't somehow eventually test your theory, it's unclear what you're actually doing. But it sounds like this they would not accept the idea of an empirical test of their theory, I suppose.
Well, that's correct, because they would actually, if the empirical test supports their theory, then that was good. But if it does not, then it would disagree with somebody's lived experience and is therefore committing a transgression of power against them. A good example of that happened, and you can actually, there's a wonderful documentary put together by my friend Mike Nana on YouTube about the Evergreen State College near Olympia, Washington, that melted down a couple of years ago around this. And there's a scene in there where you can see my friend Brett Weinstein became a target of a student revolt of some kind there, and they're protesting and they're screaming, "This is a racist institution," as we often hear on college campuses now. This is a racist institution. And he says, being very progressive as Brett is, he says, "Show me the evidence. If it's racist, we want to fix it. I want to see the evidence. Let's find the evidence." And they tell him back that asking for evidence denies the lived experience. If you we're Black, you would experience this, you would already know. And so you're denying our lived experience. So asking for evidence, they say, is in fact racist. And so, again, totally hermetically sealed. It's not possible to disagree in good faith. You have to commit an ism or a phobia in order to check the claims, unless the evidence supports their claims, in which case the evidence is obviously
so it sounds like if two people are in conflict, the resolution of the conflict is based on some combination of identity and the extent to which the opinion adheres to some established set of ideas. So that's how we use it. That's the sort of way you resolve.
That's exactly correct.
And
that is exactly correct. And the theory goes above the identity, right? So when Kanye West puts on a Make America Great Again hat and says, I think for myself, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in the Atlantic 2 days later, you ain't Black. Joe Biden says, if you vote for me, or if you vote for Trump, you ain't Black, or whatever.
So then, like, if we, so I'm trying to, like, this is very hard for me to get my head around, but like, if I run a regression on a topic and someone else who has a different identity than me runs a regression, is it assumed that, like, even if we code the exact same thing, is that more valid than mine? Or is it just the idea of a regression is not okay?
Well, it depends. The idea of the regression is still probably not okay, again, unless it supports the correct orthodoxy. And then it's okay. And then, so if you run it and then somebody with a different identity runs it, and you guys disagree, you have the same coding, the same data, but you somehow get a different result, right? Whichever result is consistent with theory is more correct. That's the first thing. Now, if you were to both agree with theory, but slightly differently, and you had different identities, the other person's would count more than yours, unless you can claim some oppressed perspective that gives you special insight. They call that a standpoint epistemology, or the feminists did in the 80s and 90s. And standpoint epistemology has kind of been refined intersectionally into what they call positional thinking, or positionality is the current name for that.
So to be clear, then, which one of us has a bug in our code is not relevant to this discussion.
That's right.
Okay, that's interesting.
That's
Very
right.
different. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's very alarming. I understand. When I first read the Feminist Glacier paper myself, I actually closed the door. I went into one of the back rooms in my house, a spare bedroom, and closed the door and just kind of like sat there in the dark weeping for science for like 3 days. I couldn't believe that this is actually being published in high impact factor academic journals.
And I suppose, so a lot of this is like about kind of breaking down the idea that we have objective knowledge, I guess. Like, to some extent, you break this, like, and there's some relation to metaphysics here, right? Like, what is it that we actually know? Like, epistemology is kind of a thing, but it seems like we're breaking down the sort of standard approaches to knowledge, but then at the same time we have this other realm of certainty. Is that, like, how are we, like,
so Descartes said, I think, therefore I know I am, or therefore I am, I should say. I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which is funny because he actually wrote it in French and he never actually put it in Latin. But at any rate,
sounds better in Latin.
Yeah, right. So cogito ergo sum. And then this would be, I suffer systemic oppression, therefore I am. Right. And so systemic oppression, the subjective experience of systemic oppression, as defined by the critical theory, is in fact that which is objectively true. Everything else is up for grabs. And you can find this pretty close to explicitly near the end of Kimberly Crenshaw. She's one of the creators of critical race theory, and she is the creator of intersectionality. She wrote a paper in 1991. It's very famous, called Mapping the Margins. Near the end of that paper, she has a famous paragraph where she explains the difference between the statement, I am Black, and the statement, I am a person who happens to be Black, which is a direct refutation of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. If you recall, most people don't. Google it, check it out for yourself. The signs that they carried around during the civil rights movement in the 1960s said, I am a man. They didn't say I'm a black man. They were rejecting the idea of the identity category. Kimberly Crenshaw, following Bell Hooks and some others in 1991, says, no, we need to put the identity category back. And she said, because otherwise you erase the subjectivity of the subject. And that becomes the so-called objective reality, that lived experience of oppression. And if you want to tie that back to critical theory, there's an early essay from the very early Frankfurt School by one of the lesser known Frankfurt School theorists named Walter Benjamin, who talks about, in German, I guess there are two words. I don't know German, so I'm limited here, but there are two words for experience. One means, that which you have experienced in the normal sense, and one which means what we now use lived experience to represent, this thing that's informed my life and it works almost like better data. And so fast forward back to 1991, you erase the validity of that lived experience if we try to universalize. I could actually read the paragraph. I don't have it open on my desktop right now, or my laptop right now, but I read it last night. Again, we could read the paragraph. She says it quite explicitly, that what matters is that there is a inherent meaning in the subjective experience of systemic oppression. And that becomes the rock upon which their entire worldview going forward from 1991 is built.
Okay, so we've got it. So I think we're getting a good picture of the structure in which they sort of, you're supposed to understand how the world works, and that it's fairly divorced from how we think about like theory.
A good example that touches what's happening in the world. There's if a paper, and I know this has happened a couple of times in the past couple of years, if a paper were to come out that studied crime statistics and police statistics and found that there's no racial bias in police violence of certain types, say use of lethal force or something like this. If a paper were to come out, and I know there was actually one in Texas last year or the year before, I forget which, that did this with extremely careful analysis, independent research group, the whole thing, very, professionally done by actual statisticians, et cetera. And they found that there was, I forget what particular dimension of use of force it was, but they found that there was no racial bias in Texas law enforcement in whatever particular use of force it was. Not all uses of force, it was a particularly narrow one. They found none. And the result was that not only did that denied the lived experience of people who believe that there is one, that they feel that in their heart because that's what they experience in their day-to-day life, but that it was so egregious that the paper should be retracted, that the people who wrote it should have their PhDs revoked, should have all their other papers retracted, et cetera. That was the response that came. And I know this because the Hispanic researcher who wrote the paper reached out to me to tell me that this is what happened to her and asked if I had any advice.
That would be a bit of a segue. I mean, this very odd sort of, well, I shouldn't judge, perhaps it's valid, but this different way to think about policy or to think about evidence. But then to circle back, this is also supposed to be activism, right? So
that's right.
We're supposed to be using this, and I was wondering, like, this seems like an issue again to go back to like the effect on the classroom. So when I go into a classroom as a critical theorist, do you have a sense, what is the mission here? Is my mission to make the students understand things better, or do I have some other mission?
No, your mission is to make the student understand how to inculcate the normative vision and help make the student understand how the existing society falls short of that normative vision and how to teach them to be activists in accordance with bringing that normative vision into being.
Okay, that helps me understand something that I noticed here. We have the core requirements, and then we have this other thing called flags, which every student has to achieve one of these flags in each of these areas. Mm-hmm. And one of our flags is a cultural diversity in the United States flag. And the description of the class, one of the things it said that could be done to fill this is that you might be asked to engage in an activism project. So is that? So I was sort of shocked when I saw that. I was like, you can be forced to, in order to get credit for a class, you're supposed to go engage in activism, and that's
typical in these departments. Actually, we were shocked when we were first doing the grievance studies affair. One of the papers we wanted to write led us to look up a large number of gender studies, specifically departments at different universities, probably 80 of them or so, and to read their website. And we counted how many of them mentioned something about activism. And it was I don't remember the statistics, but it was a clear majority. It was, in fact, it was a large, wide majority, a super majority, if you will. So activism is core to their mission, but that makes sense. Didn't at the time to us. We were shocked, but now that we understand that you must wed theory to praxis in Marx's language, or as they said, you have to encourage social activism on behalf of that normative vision as part of a critical theory. It's part and parcel. It is by definition not a critical theory if you don't encourage taking action and doing activism as part of it. So it's shocking when you first encounter it, but that is by definition what constitutes a critical theory. A critical theory is not just the very kind of I don't know, it's almost propagandist the way that it gets explained. Oh, it's uncovering under-examined biases and showing what hidden assumptions people have. That's the very like charitable explanation of what critical theory is that you'll often hear. But that's not what was outlined in 1937. That's not what was fully systematically explained in the subsequent book by Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno in 1944, in the book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And that's not what was asked to be put into practice in the second generation of the Frankfurt School by, say, Herbert Marcuse, if you read, for example, Repressive Tolerance or One-Dimensional Man. Those are 1965 and 4, respectively. So this was a very, and that the 65, 64 is very, of course, relevant because that's when so much was changing in society and so much was changing with the nature of what was going on in the university. So many of these leftist, I will say, in a very strong way, activists started to take a very active role in putting their activism into the university. Marcuse explicitly called for a union between the racial minorities, the radical outsiders, and the leftist intelligentsia. And he said it was very important that they essentially colonize the university.
Okay, well, so that would lead me to another on this. Given this emphasis on activism and the primacy of these ideas over anything else, this would seem like a difficult thing to square with the general concept of academic freedom at a university. So, I'll just, like, personal experience. I've been developing this sense from, I served on an academic freedom committee, and just from seeing what's going on at the university, I have this feeling that at the university, the idea of academic freedom is almost like a collective right instead of an individual right. And I'm wondering if this like we are supposed to be able to decide as a body what can be said at the university, and we must defend ourselves from outside influence from regents or legislatures. But I don't get it. There's very little interest in protecting individual academics within the university.
Right.
It's almost like,
I mean, I don't agree with his conclusions, for example, but you could use I know it's even controversial to mention the name. Maybe I should whisper it like Voldemort or something. But Charles Murray with his IQ research, I actually don't agree with the IQ research myself. I find it not to be a very persuasive argument for explaining differences across groups.
It does seem like an awful lot of work to squeeze out something that would be virtually impossible to tease out.
Right. I mean, there's so many difficult confounding variables, and I'm skeptical of it. I find that it's far, far, far more likely that cultural influences are a much more dominant variable. But you wouldn't dare write that paper even. You don't have any academic freedom. Your tenure won't protect you. You don't have academic freedom to explore many, many sorts of questions. And this problem has increased over time in terms of the limits of academic freedom, to the point now where, like I said, if you put another good example, I mentioned the Gonzalez crime or police use of force paper. Another good example is Portland State University, Bruce Gilley. He published a paper a couple of years ago called A Defense of Colonialism, or something close to that. In Defense of Colonialism something. And he drew upon large numbers of highly respectable-ish, given the circumstances of the subject, scholars like in Zimbabwe and other previously colonized African nations, talking about how they make arguments that while colonialism was brutal, while colonialism had all these evil facets to it. While colonialism did all these harms, it also built infrastructure. It also brought riches. It also brought education. And so it had these positive elements. And Bruce Gilley got charged with a Title IX violation, said he was a threat to students to even be on campus. They tried to get his PhD taken away from him. So academic freedom, again, like he didn't just like write this. It wasn't some reactionary, insane piece. This was a peer-reviewed piece that actually passed peer review and was published in a journal based on scholars in these contexts who he took seriously and listened to in their own terms, but it had a completely politically unfashionable conclusion. And the result was, absolutely going after the journal, going after the editor, going after him, and trying to get his degree granting institution to revoke his degrees. I mean, it's just absolutely, fortunately, I think all that happened was that the paper was retracted, which then resulted in it being published otherwise with the Streisand effect, and it was read by 80 million more people than it would have been otherwise. But nevertheless, this isn't how academia is supposed to work. It's a direct affront to what the point of tenure is even supposed to be. Tenure is not supposed to be to produce a country club. It's to protect academics to be able to do research that needs to be done because, as you pointed out, the politics becomes a dangerous thing. To be able to seek truth, we learned with Galileo, for example, is a dangerous thing when there are the powers that be. And now the powers that be happen to be within the gates of the university, and academic freedom has suffered tremendously as a result. I mean, certainly we were attacked in saying that we violated academic freedom by doing the grievance studies affair, which we consider to be a white hat operation, as they call them.
Which, that does sound like you're violating academic freedom by impinging on the ability of the collective group of faculty to decide what ideas are acceptable or not. I guess that's
it was fairly preposterous.
But
it was fairly preposterous. And when, for example, Trump issued the executive order banning what he called race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating, which was more famously regarded as the critical race theory executive order. If you actually read the thing, Section 10, Part B says that it should not be construed to say that you can't teach this as an academic subject. And yet it was challenged, even in court, as destroying academic freedom. Mm-hmm. Even though it says that it leaves room to teach it as an academic subject, straight in the wording of the document itself, of the order itself, it was still construed and attacked as a limit on academic freedom, because it said that you can't teach it as uncontested fact. You can only teach it as one theory among others.
Mm. Yeah, so we have another policy here that it's actually apparently been backburnered, but I wonder if this is also related. We were going to have a situation where you need a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer on all hiring committees, and everyone will have to be, it's not just that you have to assert that you believe this stuff, but you were supposed to demonstrate that you have done actions to bring about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So is that
you participated in social activism on behalf of the normative vision? Yeah.
Okay, so that is sort of within this framework of.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they say, they tell you when they introduce these things that it won't be used as a litmus test for hiring, and then that absolutely gets, or for tenure or whatever else, that absolutely gets blown out of the water the very second, it gets tested. Mm-hmm. Famous example at UC Berkeley was that they said that in their biology department, and then they excluded something like 74 or 76. It's on one side or the other, 75% of the applicants based on their diversity score that they had assigned. They had to write a statement, and then it was scored 1 to 5 on this, 1 to 5 on that, 1 to 5 on the other thing, and 75 or thereabouts percent of the applicants were excluded based on that entirely, never even looked at their academic merit. And this is coming out more and more and more that obviously academic hiring is extraordinarily competitive. They have to fight. You get 200 300 people applying for a single job. You got to find ways to cut things down to maybe 10 or 11 to start interviewing and checking. But I understand the difficulty. But to just completely not even look at the academic credentials or the CV of 3/4 of your applicants based on a political litmus test is shocking for the one thing, and probably illegal for another.
I wonder how that got as far as it did here in a state school
I got nothing to say to defend the state of California in any regard whatsoever at this point. But in Texas, it's a little more shocking. Although I do understand that Mr. Abbott has taken something of a stand for academic freedom and so on. So Texas may be in slightly better standing than UC Berkeley, which is sort of famous for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because that's where I was looking at the effect there, and then I saw the same. Somebody leaked this policy, and it got a little coverage, and I was like, oh, it looks like we're going down the Berkeley path. But well, I guess we're running low on time. It's been fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Sure.
It was a little more distressing than many of these, but thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your work.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, if there's any questions or whatever, I'm happy to answer. If we're just dead out of time, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think we have sort of a constraint that I'm getting.
Okay.
Getting a hook on from my
I got
colleagues,
you.
so I guess we have a target. Okay, thank you again. Thank you very much.
Yep. If you ever want to have me back, I'll happy to come talk to you more about whether it's postmodernism or what other aspects of this.
That would be great.